Well, like some of you already know, my name is Maria Mala, and I'm the Grassroots Advocacy Manager for UNA USA. It's already been mentioned before, but yes, I'm the one who's been harassing you. And some of you might be waiting on an apology from me, but the truth is I'm not sorry. This is very important work. And so I just wanted to take a moment to speak to that before we start, speak to the change that we're about to make tomorrow. So from Michigan, actually, several of our UNA USA members are participating in congressional meetings tomorrow, and they have meetings with 7 members of Congress from their delegation, with the actual members of Congress. That's amazing. And I would like to recognize Janice, also UNA USA, who is the only person who signed up for Hill Day from Rhode Island. And she's actually going to meet with the Senator, Jack Reed, who serves on the Senate Appropriations Committee. Can anyone tell me what the Senate Appropriations Committee does or what it's about? Hello? Okay. Any guesses? No wrong answers. Yeah, it's about money. Sorry, I thought there was just mumbling in the crowd. I didn't hear the money part. But yeah, that's right, money. It's about money. Who gets what money, how much money they get. So why is this an important moment if it is about money? And she's meeting, yeah, well, not necessarily. But this is someone who, this is a member, yep, where the money goes. Thank you, Deborah. So this is about one of our members meeting directly with a senator who serves on the Senate Appropriation Committee, who has a direct vote on funding. Amazing, amazing stuff. So it's really important to show up and show out. So speaking of showing up and showing out, a lot of people, a lot of members in Congress think that young people don't vote, that they're not engaged. And actually, we have a group of students who came to participate in Hill Day, and they will be meeting with their senator, Senator Tesser from Montana, the senator himself, who serves on the Senate Appropriations Committee. So another great example of showing up and showing out. So I'd just like to give an extra round of applause for Montana. Truly amazing stuff. So these are folks who, decided to sign up and show out. And, this is all to say some of them are experienced, some of them are not. And like I've said before, 3 months ago, I was working for a congressional office. And when I first started to work on the Hill, I thought the Capitol building was the White House. I had no idea, what anything was going on, what was about in Congress. I mean, it was just like a whole new process. And that's all to say that I just didn't pop out one day on this earth knowing everything about, the congressional appropriations process and all the things that go into it. So this is why this session is so special, is that we get a training session on, the do's and don'ts, what's going into accounts, what's not going into accounts, just like the nitty-gritty about these details. And you don't have to, grind your way on the Hill to try to learn, these kinds of information. But I think that in that learning process, something that was really an anchor and a motivational, key for me was remembering the passion about why I wanted to work on the Hill or to participate in the congressional process. So I would love it if maybe a couple of you would share why you all joined UNA USA. Anyone? Anyone brave?
Hi, my name is Alicia Morse. I am from UNA USA Greater Detroit and a newly elected national council. That's how new I am. I was talking to Mr. LA, Dave from LA, from Orange County, and LA. And we were discussing how some people don't know about UNA USA. And I was saying that I didn't know it existed. And I went to an event and somebody asked me about working for former Senator Kerry, Bob Kerry, the rich one. And, well, I mean, he is richer. And I got recruited to be the advocacy chair, not just because of that experience, but also because I knew incoming Congress people from my state before they were elected, namely Rashida. Everybody knows her from the squad. So they thought, oh, you have inside connection, you have experience from it. So I came in just because of advocacy, but then I learned the passion when I learned about the SDGs. And of course I knew about the United Nations, but then I just became passionate and I became crazy in it. And then I found the Lansing chapter and it took it to a whole different level. Bob, Lynn, hey. So there you go.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Especially important, because the Michigan State is very strong involvement. Anyone else care to share?
Hi, my name is Robin. I'm from Anchorage, Alaska, and thank you. And I joined UNA USA originally about 6 years ago when I did my college internship with the United Nations Development Program. And then once I graduated college, I kind of took a step back from everything. I developed my own nonprofit, and now that we are on the ground, I wanted to get back involved with it because not only do I work in advocacy for survivors of human trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual violence, I know the UN is huge for that as well, and I thought it would be great to get re-involved, get people in my community more involved, and advocate for the UN and their services as well.
Amazing stuff. Alaska's pretty far away, so she can show up, anyone can. Anyone else care to share?
Hello, my name is Alimata Koulibaly, and I started my membership back in 2008 in Monterey chapter, California. Then, but I haven't been an active member after a few years. So, and I came back this time in New York, and now I'm part of the New York chapter, Brooklyn. So I just want to make sure that I always advocate for, the cause in favor of the most vulnerable.
Amazing. She moved states and still remembered to rejoin.
Thank you. I'm Bettina Hausmann, California chapter in San Diego, and I started in 1992 in Europe. And for me, UN association was really about civil society, efforts from the grassroots, and learning how we actually were instrumental in bringing the United Nations into birth was really, for me, one of the major points in terms of to show this was a real bottom-up institution, and we're not accountable to anyone else but our members and our shared responsibility for us as humanity. And so that is, for me, really the key why we're so strong. That we are really the people speaking for the people, for us, how we want to shape this world. And I think that's where our power lies. And that's why I joined and still am with the UN Association now in the US. Thank you.
Very powerful words. Like I said in my advocacy training before, closed mouths don't get fed.
Good morning. My name is Barry Simon. I'm with the Los Angeles chapter. I live in Santa Monica, California, because somebody has to. I've been in 1976, I was introduced to the phrase of the possibility of a world that works for everyone with no one and no thing left behind. And that carried forward to 2005 when I was asked to help work with the Pasadena chapter on the 60th anniversary event of the UN that they were planning. And I've been involved with UNA ever since that date in 2005. I continue to be involved and consider this really my home for international and local involvement to that commitment of making a difference in the world. There's no other, we could all be in, you're all committed people. And there's plenty of NGOs that would love to have your support and assistance, whether it be in the area of Doctors Without Borders or hunger projects, et cetera, et cetera. But there's only one organization, NGO that I know of, that covers all the bases, and that's the UN Association. So I'm honored and proud to be a member, and I became a lifetime member last year. I invite all of you to become lifetime members, and that's why I'm a member of UNA.
Thank you all for sharing your stories. This is real passion we're talking about. So that's a real anchor that we use to hold us down when we're trying to cut through this very heavy information. Motivating factor, really. So in this session, we'll discuss how you can leverage information to build relationships in the 117th year of Congress and help you make a case for the UN in your community. In addition, we will review the functions of Congress, understand our legislative priorities, and learn what to expect on Capitol Hill this year. So before we get started, I would really like to thank our involvement with our sister campaign, the Better World campaign, because without them, really, our work wouldn't be possible. So just, this is a chart to explain the organization of the United Nations Foundation. So like I said before, they're our sister campaign. So we do slightly different functions, but we work together to make things possible. And so to better understand this relationship, I'll just outline some of the functions that we have in common and different. So we work together closely to inform and inspire and mobilize Americans to support the principles and the vital work of the UN. So UNA USA is a membership organization that provides an opportunity to connect with 120 chapters and across the US and engage elected officials in local communities. The Better World campaign encourages US leadership to work hand in hand with the UN to better tackle the world's biggest issues by engaging policymakers, the media, the American public, and to build support for the UN's life-saving work. Every year, the Better World campaign puts on a really neat book, the Congressional Briefing Book. How many of you all have taken a look at this book? Okay, a couple of folks, yeah. Anything interesting in the book that stands out to you all? Anything interesting in the book, the Congressional Briefing Book, that stands out to you all? Right, nothing comes to the top of mind quite yet. Oh, yes, key data. That's really important. Yes, key data. And I've been, shoving this book at you guys very frequently, and it's filled with key data. But how can we use this key data in our everyday lives? We got to think of real life scenarios where we can apply this. And I know that you guys have, maybe you come across scenarios where these answers could be used, but we don't really connect the dots. So in this next portion, I would really like to put forth those connections so that we can use this information, again, in everyday life scenarios. So kind of silly, slide 4. So Laura, from your son's after-school pickup group, says to you, you spend a lot of time volunteering with the UN Association. Doesn't the UN just sit around in suits and take meetings? And this was inspired by something my friend said to me, so real life situation. So do we say in 2020, UNICEF delivered more than 65.9 million doses of polio, measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines to children in humanitarian emergencies across 15 countries. Or on December 31st, 2019, the World Health Organization, WHO, received information through a disease reporting database about unexplained pneumonia cases in China, which would be, you know, fit the situation better. So the one on the left, right? Yes, the first one. So you and your friend are having a discussion. They're complaining about inflation. They say to you, I don't know, the UN seems like a waste of money. So which one of these answers fits better in this situation? You could say to your friend, 1.8 billion. And then they say, what? And you say, 1.8 billion. That's the US share of the UN peacekeeping budget, which is less than what Americans spent on Halloween candy in 2019. Mouths dropped, mic dropped. That's it. It ends the conversation there. Or do we say, after a year-long delay due to the COVID-19 pandemic, world leaders, the private sector, and activists gathered for COP26 in Glasgow? Not quite the response, right? So the one on the left. So this one's a little bit more trickier. You're meeting with your member of Congress. They have a competitive primary. They say to you, why is the UN relevant to me? Which answer fits better? Yes, why? Because it's specific to at home. Exactly, exactly. So like I said before in my advocacy trainings, we always got to think about the framework and the, what that person is thinking when they're coming to us, talking to us about the UN and the work that we're doing. We got to meet them halfway. Sometimes we don't always agree about, what they're thinking about, but we got to recognize these moments so that we can, be better advocates and really share key information with them. Now, this is just a fact, but can anyone think of just any hypothetical scenario where they could possibly use this fact in an everyday conversation or maybe in a meeting with a member of Congress?
The issue around Roe versus Wade.
Yeah, exactly right. Anybody else want to take a try? No wrong or right answers.
I think a big misconception is that the UN Population Fund funds abortions overseas, and so you can explain to them, no, they do not. They provide reproductive and sexual health services such as contraception, and they work to end gender-based violence and FGM.
Awesome, really great answers. So we have another fact on here. How about this one? Can anyone think of a real life scenario where they may be able to use this information? Again, no wrong or right answers.
I think this would actually be a really great talking point when our member from Rhode Island meets with the Senate Appropriations Committee head.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I think more specifically, in context of UN, I would think about the member states and how that would be relevant, for that discussion.
Absolutely. How about this fact? Can anyone think of a real life scenario?
Hi. In relation to what Gabe was talking about this morning with the agricultural program in Africa, promoting agriculture can be an 11-fold return on investment, and supporting peace and security in these countries will make the U.S. safer.
Yeah, you could definitely use that in that situation. You know, talking to some folks, just some of my friends, you know, I hear there's a lot of attention on Ukraine. So this might be a fact that you could bring up when someone says, well, they're just only focused on Ukraine. Well, you can point to this and say, well, we're actually doing work in other countries too. So this is important stuff. We have one more raised hand over here.
Hi everyone, my name is Handel Curzon. I'm from Chicago, and originally, and I like to say this, I'm from Palestine, and it is because I want people to know more about Palestine. And I think in this situation, it'd be great to bring up a personal story. And so the reason I actually came to the United States is because of the 2008-2009 war that happened in Palestine, and that is when I lost my house. I lost my home due to destruction of the building I was living in, which contained of 12 floors. And so the reason I'm here is due to the war zone situation that's happening. And so since I stepped feet, and I know I'm talking a little bit more about the context here, but I think this is really important to bring up and to share more about making connection, real connection, a genuine one. And so for me here, I think I owe it to myself, to the United Nations, to you guys doing the work to help and really show appreciation to the funds that are being received by the United States. And so, you know, since I stepped feet, I knew I needed to make a change and even just have my voice be heard. And so I know there's a lot of people, and my family, it's my family back home that are struggling to resources like this, to food, water, electricity, basic needs to be able to live and move forward and make a change in this world. I was actually talking this morning to Barry about this, this issue, and I know that there are families that survive off of $100 a month. And we're talking about a family of 15 members. And it's a struggle. And I know some of you might know about this problem, but I think a lot more people need to do the research on this. You might hear the news, and I know you've also heard that, oh, you know, we hear fake news, and I think you really need to do that research and connect with people that have underwent through, you know, such situations. And so if you happen to speak to someone in power, in, you know, having access to additional resources, you know, additional people in control of such aid, please bring up this situation. I'm totally okay with you bringing this up. Share your own personal stories. I know you are all amazing people. I thank each and every one of you very much for being here. We appreciate it as a Palestinian people, and every other person that's facing the struggles right now in the world is waiting for people like you, waiting for just a single word. We appreciate it very much, and please continue doing this. And yeah, I think this is my 1 cent here on this topic, and I hope I wasn't too long. Thank you.
Very powerful. And that pretty much summed up, you know, the personal story, the data. So thank you so much for sharing that very personal story. Thank you. And so with that, I will now welcome the Executive Director of the Better World Campaign, Jordy Hannum, to set the stage for us, or rather the picture, on what's going on in Congress right now.
Hello all, how you doing? Nice to see it. All right, let's see here. Is this working? Oh, this is it. There we go. All right, so it's really good to be back. Here. This is my 13th UNA Summit, and our first hybrid one, you know, part virtual, part in person. I'm hoping next year maybe it can be like a triathlon. We can add like an underwater component or something. But seriously, it's just so good to see you all, and to do this hybrid model, and this may be, you know, a way forward. Obviously, it's fantastic to see old friends and meet new ones, to suffer in the Washington heat together. But you know, the beauty, of course, is of the virtuals, we can bring a lot more people into the mix, and so hopefully this works well. And it's certainly timely. I feel like the last few years we've just absolutely gotten the timing right. But I mean, Secretary Blinken was just on the Hill. Assistant Secretary for International Organizations will be on the Hill on Wednesday, testifying in front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. UN Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield will be testifying on Wednesday in front of the House State Foreign Operations Subcommittee on funding. So the timing is spot on, and it's also an opportune time because, you know, the UN has been on the front pages for months now. I mean, of course, some of that is directed towards Ukraine, but there's also, I imagine folks have seen, you know, the High Commissioner for Human Rights was just in China, the first visit since 2005 that generated a lot of press coverage, not all positive. Plus, international funding for COVID response has been a hot topic. And I think there's kind of an election coming up, so we've got the midterms coming up, and that's kind of sharpened some of the divisions on funding, on international affairs versus domestic, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And there's some concerning partisan splits, but there's also some silver linings, and we'll get into that. So to quote from the classic film Smokey and the Bandit, we got a long way to go and a short time to get there. So let's get started here, right? So last year at this time, we talked you know, about kind of where things were, and we were all kind of quite bullish in terms of UN and UN funding, and things look perfectly teed up for us. So for a number of reasons, it didn't work out quite as well as we thought, but certainly there was a lot of singles and doubles, not as many home runs. But let's just, I thought we could quickly check the box score from last year and see what runs we got across the home plate. Yes, I was at a baseball game yesterday. So, one, the Biden administration rejoined the Paris Agreement on climate change. Two, we rejoined the World Health Organization and paid back $200 million in arrears. We restored funding for UNFPA and the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees. We rejoined the Human Rights Council. We paid back the almost $100 million in arrears to the Council and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And as a perfect example of the benefits of that engagement, we were able to leverage our renewed credibility to lead a coalition to oust Russia from the Human Rights Council last month over its illegal invasion of Ukraine. Right, it's why you join these bodies. It's not just to say you're in the room, but when you're in the room, you can actually make a difference, and this is the perfect example. In less heralded news, but I imagine some of you all will be familiar, but instead of losing our voice in a number of UN bodies, as we did from 2017 to 2021, the U.S. ran 7 campaigns for U.S. candidates in UN elections, winning 6 races, okay? And these victories reinforce U.S. multilateral engagement and returned independent experts to serve on the Committee to Eliminate Racial Discrimination, the Committee Against Torture, the National Narcotics Control Board, and elected a U.S. expert to serve on the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. These bodies matter, and they're more muscular when the U.S. is participating, okay? And again, these are a number of really important wins that we saw from engagement. Okay, so those are the positive. Those were what we got across the plate. We did suffer some losses. We were not able to rejoin UNESCO, came right down to the wire, but not able to get it across the finish line. Unfortunately, efforts to start paying back our peacekeeping arrears did not materialize. We still stand over $1 billion in arrears, and we have not lifted the arbitrary 25% cap on peacekeeping contributions that prevents us from paying in full. And we, along with many in our coalition, were dismayed that after March of 2021, there was no additional funding for the international COVID response. And I actually wanted to kind of ask everyone a question. How much U.S. international funding has been devoted to the COVID response? Any guesses? 1%, 10%, 20%? I need to put on my glasses to see. Sorry. Any guesses? How much U.S. money has gone to the international COVID response? Yes, ma'am, right there. Huh? 1%. Okay, we've got some in the 1% camp. Anything else? 3? Okay. Less than 1. I should know. It was a trick question. 0.3%. 0.3% of U.S. funding. So 18 billion out of 6 trillion. So 0.3%. And I think this is a good place to kind of pause for a second, especially with midterms coming up, and say, why did this happen? And really more broadly, why is there still such distrust of international aid in Congress, even in the middle of a global pandemic? So again, question for the crowd. Why is there still such distrust for international aid, even given, you know, the past couple of years have shown the importance? Yes, sir, right there.
Maybe giving more attention to the local.
That's right.
And the second one is maybe the private, most of the time,
I can hear you, yeah.
maybe private partnership is for working on this area because vaccine producers, they are directly engaged with African countries and some other country who needs the vaccine or tests. So maybe a couple of this point I mentioned.
That's right. So, right, there's the focus on local versus international, and then the feeling the private sector can step up and better fit. Mr. Simon, nice to see you.
Nice to see you, sir. Very great. Maybe a third of this country, maybe you can't hear me too well, maybe a third of this country is very, very selfish.
I like that. Let's just cut to the chase. Yeah. Yeah, so certainly part of it is it's always easy to kind of demonize international funding, and you know, and we saw, you know, this, and we saw that in earnest here. I think one other point to raise, which is particularly kind of relevant with the midterms coming up, is foreign policy is rarely raised as a topic on the campaign trail, right? So just to give one example, so out of almost 7,000 unique Republican and Democratic campaign ads aired in the 2020 cycle, only about 9% touched on foreign policy and national security issues. And that's way up from 2016 and 2018, when it was about 2%. So there's just not a lot of discussion on foreign aid, and when it does come up, it's negative. There's one other issue which is more complicated, and we're kind of grappling with it now. But if you look at polls and exit polls, you know, of course, you see a split, a partisan split. Democrats more in support, Republicans less so. But it's particularly pronounced in the U.S. So this is a poll that Pew did actually about 2 years ago, but found that Americans are more divided ideologically on whether the UN advances the interests of countries than any other nation, a 40-point difference, okay? Sweden is next at 26%. So that's a challenge, needless to say. But before you lose all hope, we did our first 50-state poll last year, and we've talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to highlight it again. And this is what we found, that majorities in all 50 states support U.S. participation in the UN. And it's not just liberal voters, but a majority of independents, 80%, and conservative, 60%, say it's important for the U.S. to be an active participant in the UN. They do not want us to withdraw, okay? And we did this on a state-by-state basis, okay? And you can, I don't know if folks can see that, but in states like Alabama and Louisiana, 59% of residents supported the UN's global work, so 60%, okay? That was the lowest level, okay? Kansas, North Dakota, 65%, okay? Minnesota at 70%, right? So you saw strong support across the country. I mean, these results were better than I thought. I would have thought that in some places would have been 50, even less than 50. So at the lowest level, you see 60% engagement. That is really, really strong. So what explains these contrasting results? We got one side, we've got saying there's huge partisan splits. On the other side of the coin, we see that actually there is some real unity and a strong support for the UN across the aisle. So, any guesses? Why do we see these splits? Yes, ma'am. Yep, and you're dead on there. So again, not a lot of it. Sorry? Oh yeah, she just said there's not a lot of knowledge kind of on what the UN does. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Building on that point, I think that too many people have the misconception of the UN as a world government and judge it by a standard that it was never set up to meet. And so understanding the nuances of how the UN actually was created and is meant to operate.
Yep. So again, I think people heard that but not quite understand what the UN does. Yes, ma'am.
Is it me? Oh, hi. Sorry. Just to add one point, I think we kind of get caught up in demonizing people who don't believe in the UN, but we do have to remember, and maybe my statistic is out of date, but only 25 or 30% of Americans have passports. So, you know, they haven't seen people living in abject poverty. They haven't seen people affected by conflict situations. So, you know, it's really our responsibility living in the US to do this and, you know, increase support for programs that get Americans out of their bubble. I think there have been a lot of like recent current events that have really captivated people, like Afghanistan and Ukraine, and obviously ongoing situations in Syria and Yemen that really, you know, catalyze support for people. But just to reiterate, like, you know, it's not anyone's fault in the US if they don't have the information. It's our job to be bringing the information. It's really a privilege for us to have this information in the first place.
Thank you, and for underscoring, you're exactly right. I mean, part of the importance of days like tomorrow is letting them know there's people that care about and sharing their story and having people understand it. And it's also one of the reasons we do trips and make sure that those trips are bipartisan and actually showcase the work and bring UN speakers down to kind of break down that wall. But you're exactly right. Thank you for underscoring that. Let's do two more, and then we'll. They're in the blue, and then in the back we'll go.
We cannot discount misinformation.
Yeah.
And those that in fact would love to deteriorate the United States' involvement in the United Nations and the fall of the United Nations itself. And that very much is a factor as well, which again goes across hate groups as well as then the use of social media. Thank you.
Let's do one more. We'll do two more there, and then we'll go.
Sure. I am American, but I am an immigrant. I came to the U.S. about 30 years ago. And I work with international youth. And I was speaking from the perspective of a global citizen. I think there's a distrust globally with Americans. I cannot blame. I know a lot of Americans don't really care about what's happening outside of the United States. So then why would they want to spend money on helping a country that's miles and miles away and they don't know about and they don't have no interest about? So there's no shortage of need of money, and funding equals power. So U.S. being a wealthy country when U.S. put a lot of money into UN or any kind of aids, and then dictate how that money is used, what kind of programs, what kind of assistance are being provided to those areas around the world. While those people really appreciate the aid, but then there's this inequality of power position. It's the saviors, the police of the world image that's coming to my hometown, give me the money and say, you need to use money this way because this is how the world should be. Democracy, access to water, gender equality, what that means to the world. I think a lot of Americans have this, they feel like they're more aware of what should be done. And so I think there's a very delicate situation where, yes, we want your funding, but we want to decide what needs to be done with those money for our people in our hometown. So maybe that's where this issue is coming from.
And let's, you've been waiting very patiently, so yeah, one more comment, and then I know there's also a Q&A afterwards, but yes.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So I don't want to downplay, definitely misinformation I think is an issue, as well as this idea I think that we have in America of being like very exceptional and kind of wanting to put America first. But I think there's one important factor that I'm kind of surprised that nobody has touched on, and that is that our legal system is very much responsible for the reason why we see an overwhelming popular support for the UN, but why that's not reflected legally and why that's not reflected in our legislative action. There's so many types of people in this country that absolutely would want to support the UN and want to support the US's involvement in the UN, but just can't, whether it be because they are undocumented and they don't really have any voting power, whether that be because of gerrymandering, and maybe you are like a legal citizen here and you just the way that the district lines are drawn, you can't, it doesn't matter what your vote comes down to. You could be like campaigning and lobbying as much as you possibly can, but it's just not going to show up in the numbers. And I think that that's not just an issue limited to the UN, but I think that goes for a lot of issues. Like recently we had mentioned before, like the Roe versus Wade controversy that's coming up now. Like there's so many statistics that are saying what a majority of Americans agree on, and that's just not reflected legally.
Yeah, thank you. Well, so you all nailed those answers. And that's exactly right. And I think what this all also gets to is the reality that, there's not as much awareness, understanding of the UN's work. There's some challenges within it. And it means that, kind of support for the UN is weaker than we'd like, but anger at the UN is also weak. And so it's a real, what it means is it just kind of underscores the importance of our collective work, right? That there is an opportunity if you talk with folks and you share why you're passionate, you share some of the reasons, you can move the needle. So yes, there are challenges, and when things are positive in the news, it kind of swings up. When they're negative, but it also just kind of underscores the point that it's really important to keep on talking, right? That we have to kind of keep up the messaging, okay? Members have short attention spans, okay? And when you deliver positive messages, they'll respond, but we have to stay on top of them. So it makes these lobby days all the more important because we need to keep at them. And so I want to just, in the last couple of minutes, we've gone over a little time, but I never feel like we have enough time for Q&A, so I'm glad we allowed a little bit. I just want to talk a little bit more about the opportunity we do have, and I want to kind of put it in the context of kind of 3 C's, which is credibility, competition, and cooperation. So on the credibility side, President Biden actually talked about this last year in his first big foreign policy speech, but he talked about reclaiming our credibility and moral authority, okay? And kind of from 2017 to 2021, we walked away. We disengaged from a lot of bodies. And it's important to know that when we underfund, when we defund, it's not a victimless crime. It's not like, oh, the UN building can't put on a wing. If you look at peacekeeping operations, it means that troop contributing countries aren't fully reimbursed, okay? And then many of them are smaller developing nations like, PowerPoints, there we go. So anyway, you just see there, right? This is debt to troop contributing countries. That's in the tens of millions of dollars. So it just gives you an example of when we don't pay, it's smaller developing nations who are putting their troops in harm's way. You should also know, of course, that peacekeepers, are on the front lines in countering COVID, okay? And they're helping deliver supplies. They're playing a critically important role. So we need to be supporting them. It also, when we don't pay, gives an opportunity for countries to say we're not reliable and we're not a credible partner. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield talked about that last year, and that the importance of paying our bills to push back on those who would have malign intentions at the UN, end quote. And that brings us to the next two C's, competition and cooperation. So you will see, and I'm sure as you know, what members are talking about right now, Republicans and Democrats, is kind of China and Russia, and that they are our key competitors. And if that's the case, then we would argue that then our approach should follow suit, and we should counter them on every playing field that exists, and we'll be more successful and more likely to build coalitions if we are a member in good standing. And we've seen this with Ukraine, okay, right? We've talked about UN member states kicked out a permanent member of the Security Council, Russia, from a UN body, the Human Rights Council, okay? That even though Russia was blatantly threatening those countries. In March, 141 countries voted for the full withdrawal of Russian forces, most citing Russia's violation of the UN Charter. After the vote, Ukrainian President Zelensky hailed the outcome, saying the world is with us. Okay? On March 4th, the Human Rights Council passed a Ukraine-sponsored resolution to establish a commission of inquiry to investigate human rights violations and war crimes. The vote was 32-2. It's very difficult to see this outcome a few years ago. So this is the benefit of engagement. Now, it's not to say that the UN is perfect or the Security Council isn't flawed. Obviously, the Security Council couldn't stop the attack and the invasion, and that's kind of, unfortunately, with the veto power, as we know, it makes it very difficult to stop powerful states from doing what they see fit. It couldn't stop the U.S. invasion in 2003, widely viewed as violating the UN Charter. It couldn't stop it now, but it's important to know, and there were some op-eds that kind of made this point, that because the UN Security Council couldn't stop it, it means the UN's peace and security architecture was pointless, a failure, and that's not the case. There's abundant research talking about the value of the UN's peace and security work, how it's prevented war, and how peacekeeping operations have saved lives and shortened conflicts. And so you can be on firm ground tomorrow when you're talking about payment of arrears, $730 million, which is in the president's budget, which Ryan will talk a little bit more about, support for peacekeeping operations. It's also important to talk about the work of the UN regular budget, entities like the World Health Organization. I talked about what peacekeepers are doing on the front lines. Obviously, WHO is playing a valuable role in providing masks and gloves, and therapeutics, vaccines. And we know from the pandemic that in order to combat COVID, okay, it cannot be one entity acting alone. To counter a global pandemic requires partners, okay? And it means that, it's WHO and UNFPA and UNHCR and all these agencies working together. And we've seen significant progress. There's been a lot of talk about COVAX, which is the effort to provide vaccines across the world, and certainly some justified criticism. But they met their target in January, 1 billion doses. They have provided 1.5 billion doses as of a few days ago. That's in 146 countries. But we still see shortfalls. Africa, only 15% of the population. So we need to work together to tackle these challenges. And it's important to know that while there's been understandable focus on Ukraine, I mean, look at what's happened in Yemen. Well, right now the UN has worked together to come up with a truce, which is still hold. Okay, Yemen is still the world's worst humanitarian crisis. In Afghanistan, the UN has played a key role in ensuring that teachers can get salaries so they can still educate women and girls, that healthcare workers can provide medical care. This was the UN's effort. So the UN has not taken their eye off the ball, and so we need to continue support these efforts, not just in Ukraine, but in places all over the globe. So I'll stop there. I'll turn it over to Ryan, who will discuss a little bit more on kind of the aspects of the congressional budget, and then we'll have more time for questions. Thanks all.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi, it's good to see you. I'm going to take it from the chair. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Kemna. It's wonderful to see all of you, and thank you, Jordy, for that presentation. I am going to kind of run through this a little quickly, but I would like to say, just to start off, that a lot of what I'm going to be touching on is in your briefing book. So if you read nothing else in the briefing book, read the overview section, which is titled The U.S. and the UN, a Critical Partnership, the UN Budget, and U.S. Financial Contributions to the UN, because all of the information that I'm going to be giving in my presentation is right there for you. So to start off, I'd like to kind of focus on, give a broad overview of the federal budget process and how funding for the UN fits into that. And then I'm going to delve into some of the specific appropriations accounts that fund our annual dues to the UN and what we're asking for in fiscal year 2023. Maria is going to be giving a more detailed presentation later on about the specific asks and the script, but I wanted to kind of take this moment to go over things so that we're all on the same page. The power of the purse is really a key competency of Congress. It's guaranteed by the Constitution, and it's one of the most important checks that the legislative branch has on the executive. The executive branch also plays an important role in the annual appropriations process, though. One obvious way is through the president's ability to sign or veto bills passed by Congress, including appropriations bills, and another is through the submission of an annual budget request. The real action, though, is on the Hill. And that is specifically in the House and Senate Appropriations Committees, as Maria was talking about earlier. These are divided into 12 subcommittees, each of which has jurisdiction over one regular appropriations bill in their area of responsibility. With respect to UN funding, the most relevant of these panels is the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee, which handles funding for the State Department and USAID. I'm not going to go too far into the weeds on the legislative process because I don't want people's eyes to glaze over. But in short, the subcommittee produces a bill. That is then amended by the full Appropriations Committee in a meeting that is called a markup. The bills then move to the House and Senate floors, respectively, where they may be further amended before being passed. And then, both chambers of Congress have to reconcile or conference their competing bills before a final version is passed that is then sent to the president for his signature, ideally before October 1st, which is the start of the fiscal year in the US. This is how it's supposed to work, but rarely the process happens that way. Since 1977, there have only been a handful of instances where all 12 regular appropriations bills were enacted by October 1st. Instead, what usually happens is Congress has to pass one or more stopgap measures called continuing resolutions, or CRs in DC parlance, to maintain temporary funding for government agencies and programs pending final passage of final appropriations. In addition, while Congress has traditionally considered and approved appropriations bills passed by the appropriations subcommittees separately, Congress also frequently combines several or more individual bills into a single legislative vehicle, which is known as an omnibus or sometimes a minibus in DC parlance, in order to speed up the legislative process. And in fact, the past several fiscal years, actually going back a while now, have witnessed repeated cycles of CRs, followed by passage later on of omnibus measures setting final appropriations levels for the year in question. For example, even with Democratic control of the White House and both houses of Congress, the most recent final appropriations bill, which covers fiscal year 2022, was not signed into law until March of this year, so well into the current fiscal year. And this is because, appropriations bills, like the vast majority of legislation, as I'm sure many of you, have heard in the news with all of the concerns over reconciliation, are subject to filibusters in the Senate. They need 60 votes in order to end debate and move to final passage. And given the extremely slim majorities that Democrats enjoy in both chambers, Republicans were able to use this to kind of drag out negotiations and extract concessions. So now that I've kind of talked generally about the federal budget, I'd like to, focus more specifically on the international affairs budget and the UN piece of that. As I noted, the state foreign ops bill is really the key one for us. In terms of the UN specifically, there are 3 accounts or pots of money in the state foreign ops bill that are most relevant for our purposes. First, you have the contributions for international peacekeeping activities account, and this is a really critical account for us. It funds U.S. assessments for UN peacekeeping operations. Another really important one is kind of similarly titled. It's called Contributions to International Organizations, or CIO. And that funds U.S. assessed contributions to the UN regular budget, which is the core UN budget that kind of keeps the lights on in New York, as well as UN specialized agencies like WHO, the IAEA, ICAO, that family of agencies. In addition, there are non-UN international organizations that are included under that account as well, such as NATO and the Organization of American States, but the UN makes up the vast majority of that account, and the UN regular budget itself makes up about 40 to 50% of that account in any given year. And then we have another smaller account called Peacekeeping Operations, or PKO, not to confuse everyone, because I know there's one called Peacekeeping Activities, and this is Peacekeeping Operations. There's a slight difference between them. PKO is mainly focused on non-UN peacekeeping initiatives and bilateral security aid to countries, but it also provides a significant chunk of funding for UN operations in Somalia, so we advocate on behalf of that account as well. As I noted earlier, these accounts fund U.S. dues payments to the UN, which are financial contributions that we're required to make by virtue of our membership in the organization. The percentage of the UN regular budget and peacekeeping budgets that every member state pays is determined by the size of their economy and also several other factors. These rates are adjusted by the General Assembly every 3 years. And in addition, each of the UN specialized and technical agencies, like the WHO, have their own assessed budgets, which are determined separately. Again, there's more detailed information on this in the briefing book, so I encourage you to read those budget sections, which kind of go into more detail about this. These are not the only pots of money that are available to the UN in the state foreign ops bill. In fact, the vast majority of U.S. contributions are not paid as dues, they're voluntary, meaning they're set at the discretion of the U.S. government itself. The U.S. provides significant voluntary contributions to the UN from a variety of budgetary spigots, which I'm not going to get into, but these fund the bulk of the U.S. contributions to the UN's humanitarian, development, public health, and environmental work. Organizations like the World Food Program, UNHCR, UNICEF, UNFPA, and UNRWA and others are almost entirely funded through voluntary contributions from member states and non-governmental sources. So Well, the dues are not really the majority of our contributions. They make up maybe about like 25 to 30% of what we provide to the UN in a given year. They are really important because peacekeeping, special political missions, the UN's human rights work, these are really the most politically sensitive aspects of the UN's work. They're also the foundation upon which the rest of the edifice rests, providing a reliable source of funding for the UN's, peace and security work and those sorts of things is really important just to the core competencies of the organization. And in the US budget context, and Jordi alluded to this a lot, they have also been historically among the first to be targeted for cuts by administrations or members of Congress seeking to reduce US financial contributions to the UN. So that's why our advocacy asks kind of focus on those specific accounts. So in terms of where we are currently, I know Jordi went into a little bit on FY22, so I won't retread that too much. Only to say that with the final fiscal year 2022 bill, it really was a mixed bag. On the one hand, the Congress met President Biden's request for the CIO account and fully funded it. We were very happy about that. The FY22 bill also provides pretty substantial funding for our voluntary contributions to the UN, and also provided a lot of supplemental funding for the international response to the war in Ukraine. So those were all great things. The problem that we have is with peacekeeping. Again, Congress kept the 25% cap in place again this year. We're now over $1 billion in arrears on our peacekeeping dues. So that is something that is really important that needs to be taken care of. I mean, luckily though, it's a new fiscal year coming up, so we have another chance to do this. Again,
and Ryan, can you all hear me? And just one thing on that point, one positive element for this year is, again, right, so there's this cap that prevents us from paying in full. That's why we're $1 billion in arrears. But one of the congressional speakers shortly, who's coming, who spoke with us all last year, Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, is seized with this issue and is pushing a repeal of the peacekeeping cap and has actually attached it to some legislation that deals with U.S. competitiveness with China called the America Competes Act. So that issue is in play. It's going to take significant work to get it done, but we do have some key champions who are pushing it and with Congresswoman Jacobs, again, who's been a strong supporter and will be speaking with some of the group shortly. Thanks, sorry.
Hello? Okay. Thank you, Ryan and Jordi, for all that information. So we actually also have a leave behind on Advocacy Associates. It's the written form of basically what Ryan just said. And this was sent to your congressional meetings when they confirmed that you all were attending. So they're getting that information. You have access to that information. I also encourage you to go to the BWC website and take a look, because that's also there in written form. But we can now move to the Q&A portion of this, and so we have time for a couple of questions, but if you all can keep your questions brief.
Hi, thanks for being with us today. Melinda from California. Do we have any information about what we expect the ambassador to speak about when she talks on Wednesday?
Yeah, so certainly, Ukraine will be a key topic. Obviously, there's the OAS summit happening. I imagine there'll be some mention there. If you just look at the past, as I mentioned, there's been a number of different hearings. Secretary Blinken, U.S. Aid Administrator Power, and obviously the hot topics were Ukraine. And within Ukraine, there's a lot of interest in the food, kind of the food crisis elements of it. There's been significant focus on the international response on COVID, with frustration of some members that there hasn't been more support there. And then the Afghanistan raises. I don't know, Ryan, if there are other issues that.
No, I think that about covers it. I mean, I'm sure that there will also be some discussion of. Sorry, did you go over the Human Rights Council at all, or?
No, but
Yeah.
but yeah, go for
So
it.
yeah, that's another issue which is likely to come up. I think. No, I think that's.
And then the one thing on the human rights side of it is, I imagine it will come up, is, as I said, the High Commissioner for Human Rights just was in China and visiting Xinjiang. This is something that's been talked about for years, and it finally happened. And so it's the first trip by the office since 2005. My expectation, and we'll talk about this a little bit, we've got a human rights session with Congressman McGovern with some folks, but there was criticism about it that the trip did not, that the High Commissioner did not push back forcefully enough against China, that just kind of, so while there were some who were like, it's important to go and actually see what's happening, there were others that felt that there should be much more criticism directed towards China, which is a very justified argument. So I imagine that would come up during the hearing. Kind of, what is the U.S. doing to push the High Commissioner to be more forceful in terms of what's happening in China and specifically Xinjiang.
Sorry, before we go to the next question, just wanted to let you all know that the speakers are participating virtually via Hopin. So it's a non-voting day for the members who are not in DC, but you can access the recording through Hopin.
Hi, thank you for the overview. The numbers get a little confusing for me, and so I'd like to know if we can just get kind of a big picture overview of the total dollars, the total budget for the UN that was withheld over the last 4 years. And then, what is it that has been approved in the budget so far, and then what's the gap?
That's a great question. So really, I mean, the biggest pot of money in terms of like what was withheld are those peacekeeping arrears that we were talking about, the $1 billion. That's been accruing, kind of at a rate of about, I think, $200 million or so a year for the last 5 years since fiscal year 2017. So we're at $1 billion now in terms of that. In terms of the contributions for international peacekeeping activities account itself, in order to pay our dues at the full assessed rate for 1 year, it's about $1.6 billion, $1.7 billion. And what we are kind of, in our ask, we're requesting, actually it's more like 1.5, sorry. The numbers do get a little jumbled. But so we're asking for that amount for SIPA to pay our dues in full for the current year, for the upcoming year rather. And we're also asking for $1 billion on top of that to meet our arrears, basically. So that's why the total ask is $2.577 billion for that account. In terms of CIO, in terms of withheld funding, the Trump administration also withheld some funding there, specifically for the UN Human Rights Office and the UN Human Rights Council over about a 4-year period. That amount totaled $82 million, but that was actually paid off in the FY22 bill. So we're pretty current on our UN regular budget dues and dues kind of funded under the CIO account. It's really that peacekeeping number that we're the most concerned about in terms of like what we need to get taken care of. Another thing which I'll mention very quickly though, to keep in mind for the UN regular budget is that with that particular account, we are kind of always a little bit behind because the U.S. pays its dues 9 months late. So this is something which dates back to the Reagan administration. The UN kind of sends bills out to member states in January of each year, and we don't pay until the end of our fiscal year or the beginning of the next fiscal year in the fall, basically. So the UN is always kind of like at a deficit, basically, but eventually they receive their money. And so that's kind of the situation where we're in right now. So, but really the critical part is those peacekeeping funds.
And also just what, and even separate from the numbers, I mean, just if you remember nothing else, we're asking for full funding for the UN and to pay off the $1 billion in arrears. The one number is that one, because that $1 billion has all sorts of negative consequences. So it's full funding for the UN and paying off the $1 billion in arrears. Yep.
Okay, speaking of dues, we actually have a question on the online chat. What is the percentage of our past due funding versus the other major contributors? Are we equal to them, lower than them, or higher than them?
That's a great question. We are much higher than everyone else in terms of past due funding. I think in terms of peacekeeping, we probably make up
10 times higher is the simplest way. The country with the next highest shortfall is Brazil at about 100 so million. So we're 10 times higher in terms of our shortfall than the next country.
Another question from the chat for Jordy. The UN has suspended Russia from the Human Rights Council since Russia is not the entity it was in 1945, and so many countries formerly under Soviet rule are now independent member states. Could the UN General Assembly suspend Russia from the Security Council and be a member state?
I know we've discussed this. I mean, this came up. I know, kind of in the 90s, there was actually a discussion about this, and I don't. I know it was kind of resolved at that point that yes, Russia is still kind of that the goalposts kind of haven't moved, and so while some very wise folks kind of raised this as a possibility, it was addressed in the 90s, and so it's not really something that could be done unless there was a huge groundswell of support for it, which there's not. But I don't know, Ryan.
No, I mean, that's about it. I think there was the Office of Legal Affairs issued an opinion which basically stated that Russia was the successor state to the Soviet Union legally. So, I mean, could that happen? Yes, theoretically, but given the politics in the UN, would that happen? Probably not.
I think we have time for one last question, and we'll give it to maybe some of the in-person folks.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Tita Banks with UNA USA, former past chair. I wanted to say that, hi, George. Okay. In terms of going on the Hill and talking with our congressional people, I don't think that we need to get all in the weeds about the technical numbers necessarily, but just know that we are advocating for full funding, and then whatever that means. But more importantly, that the value of the U.S. having full funding is that it makes us credible. Okay, for 4 years we had to step back. We lost our credibility. And we could not say we were leaders, not either at the UN or anywhere else, because it opened the door for China's criticism, it opened the door for Russia's criticism. But at this point, we are back. That was our theme last year, right? Okay, so we are back in terms of a leadership position. And that leadership position comes with not having any doors open for criticism. Yes, we are full funded participants. That gives us our voice and our leadership to move forward. And then the second part of that is in terms of all of the areas of the world that the UN funds, why should we even be interested? Because we are not independent. We are not an island. Whatever happens in other countries directly affects us. We've seen it with Ebola, we've seen it with COVID, we've seen it with the wars and what happens with the refugee populations and how that impacts us. So yes, we are very interested in what happens in other countries because it's going to affect every congressional district. So that's all I have to say for today.
Amen.
Thanks.
Amen.
Thank you. Way to close it out. Thank you all so much for your lovely questions and participation.
Thank you all so much. And there will be another session in the afternoon where we'll talk a little bit more about the Hill and obviously be more opportunity to ask questions in terms of the Hill Day then.
And now we'll welcome Farah to explain what's next.
Well, thank you, Jordy and Ryan, for joining us. I know a lot of our members know you well, so thank you again for all that you do to help us, to help the UN. Thank you. We are now actually, you might have noticed little mice running around putting table numbers on your tables. If you will take a quick second to look at your name tags, there is a number on each of your name tags, and this is the portion for fun speed networking. So if you recall those Leadership Summit bingo cards, you can use those as prompts for questions. You do not have to use the bingo cards. But we do want you to meet other people from outside of your region and who you don't know. So we'll have a little bit of time for some fun speed networking, and then we'll come back for a concert with A.Y. Young.